Hello and welcome to The Diverse Bookshelf with me, Samia Aziz. On this show, I interview incredible authors doing a deep dive into important themes and issues while talking all things books. On this week's show, I'm speaking to Palestinian-American writer Sahar Mustafah about identity, writing, survivor's guilt, and the current war on Gaza, which has led to the killing of over 14,000 Palestinian men, women, and children to date. Over 1 million people have been displaced from their homes, and thousands remain trapped under rubble and buildings that have collapsed and are missing. Sahar's debut novel, The Beauty of Your Face, is a stunning family tale of a young woman finding herself and her faith as she explores her own Palestinian identity. The daughter of immigrants, Sahar Mustafah explores her own Palestinian heritage in her writing. She earned her MFA in fiction from Columbia College, where she was a Follett Graduate Scholar. She is a Willow Books Grand Prize winner for Code of the West, was named one of the 25 writers to watch by the Guild Literary Complex of Chicago, and is a member of Voices Protest and Radius of Arab American Writers. Her debut novel, The Beauty of Your Face, was named a New York Times Book Review Notable Books of 2020 and a finalist for the 2021 Palestine Book Award. It was long-listed for the Center for Fiction First Time Novel Award and chosen for Los Angeles Times United We Read. Sahar Mustafah writes and teaches outside of Chicago. The Beauty of Your Face tells a uniquely American story in powerful, evocative prose. Afaf Rahman, the daughter of Palestinian immigrants, is the principal of a Muslim school in the Chicago suburbs. One morning, a shooter, radicalized by the online alt-right, attacks the schools. As Afaf listens to his terrifying progress, we are swept back through her memories and into a profound and moving exploration of one woman's life in a nation at odds with its ideals. I am so glad that Sahar is my guest today. Hello, Sahar. Thank you so much for joining me on the Diverse Bookshelf today. I'm so thrilled to have you here. I can't wait to talk about your work and your book, The Beauty of Your Face, which actually came out now a good few years ago in 2020. You had a book come out in the middle of the pandemic, which I think is an interesting experience anyway. So I'm really, really thrilled to have you on the show today. Obviously, Sahar, you are a daughter of Palestinian immigrants. And so you are a Palestinian-American woman. At time of recording, we are on day, I think, 47, 48 of the most recent escalation and war on Gaza. And I just want to take a little bit of time to talk to you about your experiences, about what's going on right now. Obviously, as a child, you spent some time living in Palestine. I just want to create some space for you to just talk to me and talk to us about what you've been going through, what are some of the things that you've been thinking and you've been feeling.
Thank you. I really appreciate being invited onto the show, Samia, and I know that you have really diverse guests, and so your platform is so valuable. And I know how much you supported The Beauty of Your Face when it was launched during the pandemic, as you mentioned. For all of its destruction, it really produced some amazing global relationships. So I got to meet people from all over the globe. And so Zoom became such an amazing thing. And interestingly enough, I'm now dealing with having finished a second project, and it feels like, will this even find a home, and maybe we can get into that a little bit later in terms of what's happening politically and the American publishing industry. And I do appreciate you holding space for me just as a Palestinian-American, as a human being. It has been incredibly difficult. In so many ways, I'm grateful to be a teacher, always have been grateful, but especially now because it's really inspiring to be around young people who are not afraid to support, who are not afraid to ask questions. I'm in a school where, you just don't talk about political issues, which to me has, exposed these incredibly gross contradictions when I think about the diversity, equity, inclusion work that the administration also touts. And it feels like, silence and not being able to even grieve, but it also prevents me from educating. So I feel like I need to be very careful about having conversations. I'm able to raise Palestinian voices through literature, so that has been always my goal, and I've done that ever since I've been teaching. And now, of course, I feel kind of of an urgent need, wherever I can. But I have, private conversations with students who want to learn more. And that has been very, very heartening, because I would venture that most of the adults don't even want to touch it, Samia. And that has been incredibly disappointing and hurtful. I could count, less than 10 colleagues who've even reached out to me in some form. It's yeah. And when I think about it, and this is, professionally, and I have also lost some friends, and if they don't realize it, I think about how I haven't heard from them, so they'll not hear from me, kind of thing, so it hasn't even been very dramatic, but their silence has sort of, been incredibly loud about where they stand. I push back against anyone who equivocates about this. So I am not accepting any excuses of, well, it's sensitive, it's uncomfortable, there are two sides. So we are so past that. We're talking about 14,000 civilians who've been murdered. We're talking about hospitals that have been bombed. We're talking about journalists, right, who are trying to document the atrocities, gone. And, just recently, Musa Abu Doha was kidnapped and very fortunately has been returned after being beaten. And so, this is what happens in a genocide, right? You murder mothers, children, the artists, the journalists, and it's complete and utter erasure. So I'm just having to navigate being a citizen of a country that, sends billions of aid every year to Israel, my tax dollars, right, going to that, and thinking about how can I use my voice, civic action, my vote, to maybe make an impact, in the next election. The approval rates for Biden are so low now among Arab and Muslim communities here. And my daughter, who is just also as sad as I am, is wondering, well, do we not vote next year? And I said, no, we vote. We just don't vote for Democrats. But where does that leave us? That's what we're trying to figure out and negotiate. But we have wonderful institutes like the Arab American Institute that has been guiding civic action, among our communities. That I hope says enough, but of course doesn't cover all of it. In this moment, it's such a loaded question, right, Samia? But I want to, of course, pass it back to you.
Absolutely, and I think this sort of the question of, or like the difficulty and the discomfort that so many of us are feeling about living in a country that is supporting genocide, not just through words, but funding it and politically allowing it to continue. It's the same for those of us living in the UK. And I think in the same way that Biden is losing popularity, obviously the Conservative government is flawed in many ways, but also the other issue that in the UK we're facing is that the Labour Party, who is the opposition, is supposed to be an alternative party to the Conservatives. They have typically had mass support from the Muslim voters and communities of colour and working class communities. But the leader of the Labour Party has come out in very strong support of Israel, has cracked down very heavily on Labour MPs who have voted in favour of Palestine and in favour of calling for a ceasefire. And it's just left so many of us so lost about if you have the power to vote, but who do you
Right.
vote for? And it feels so scary when your government is essentially justifying genocide.
Right.
And I think, that is something that is, I think, taking place in so many countries around the world. And I think, I find comfort in the ability to raise one's voice in other ways and do more for the cause in that way. But I don't have any answers. I don't have no idea how things are going to turn out and what's going to happen in the next few weeks, months, and years. But I do feel like our world has changed drastically over the last few weeks, especially. And sometimes it just feels too much.
I am heartened, by the way, so I'm just about the global solidarity. So that is something that sort of balances, right? I'm thinking in my feed, as I'm scrolling, to see just the outpouring and it being so consistent is such a beautiful, beautiful thing. And I hold on to that, and to me, because that is representative of the people, and the people, can continue to rise and make change,
Absolutely. And like we move in literature spaces, and there's more people trying to educate and inform themselves about what's happening. We're having a greater promotion of Palestinian voices from the ground, which is super important as well, which is, really, really great to see. One of the things, obviously, that keeps coming up time and time again, and we're having to keep reminding people that the issue in Palestine, the war in Palestine, the occupation, the blockade did not begin on October the 7th. This is decades and decades long. And I just wondered if you could shed a little bit of light based on your personal experiences, because you lived in Palestine when you were a child. What was that like? Because even then, however many years ago that was, it wouldn't have been like a harmonious or a perfect situation. And obviously your family had to leave and haven't been able to return in the same way. So I just wondered if you could shed light on that.
Sure. So when I was 10 years old, my family brought us home. I'm from two towns. My father is from El Bira, which is right outside of Ramallah. And my mother was from El Khalil or Hebron, which is incredibly volatile in terms of violent settler interactions and presence there. But we, living in the West Bank really felt like a bubble, so we were, I would say that there was, quote, relative peace. Israeli soldiers and the presence was very strong. We would go to school and there would be soldiers marching up and down streets. So they were always there, always present. And there would be demonstrations, strikes. But even that still felt kind of muted until the Intifada, the first Intifada broke. I had a sense that, I suppose, a kind of privileged safety, being an American citizen. Not that I ever thought we'd even come back to the United States, but that it could never be so horrible, so awful. But it was definitely an experience seeing a refugee camp. My maternal grandmother, she had a house and land that was adjacent to a refugee camp that basically emerged after 1967. So after the 6-Day War. And the Israeli soldiers would use my grandmother's open roof to basically monitor the refugee camp. And I just have such a vivid picture of her, Samia, just waiting on the first floor on the edge of a sofa, basically being at their beck and call. So she would basically serve them coffee, water, tea. And it was, I felt her humiliation, but again, not always being able to articulate it at 10, 11 years old. My grandmother's house also had these hidden compartments where my male cousins would shelter. So whenever there was a demonstration, and then there would be raids, and those kinds of things have crept into my stories, So one of my projects is very much inspired by my grandmother's house, her land. And it's interesting too, because I've been sort of grappling with, and for some people this might sound strange, but appropriation, so again, sitting where I am, safe in the United States for the most part, I can write about these things, and I'm just so I worry about appropriating pain, and trauma. It's this existential crisis, among other things, being a Palestinian American.
Yeah.
But there was also joy. It was the first time that I felt like I belonged. There were peers just like me from all over the United States and the globe who had maybe been born in other places in the diaspora, whose families have now returned, to raise their children, to raise their families. And it was a most remarkable time. I just really enjoyed those friendships, and then getting to know first and second cousins, and members of, both of my parents' clans. And then also being so close to our native counterparts. So the school that I attended had an English-speaking track to basically accommodate students like me from the diaspora who were mostly English-speaking. And then there was an Arabic-speaking track. And then there were classes where we converged. And it was such an amazing experience. They had a different existence, and again, how aware I was so young. But looking back now, I just think about the generosity of spirit, that so many of them just kind of expressed to people like me, So, it's, I look back now as an adult and I think, boy, kind of being an expat, and instead of being met with disdain, and anger and resentment, especially from those who were in the refugee camps, because I also visited families in some capacity or other, and they might have been either peers or, if I had to run errands with my cousin, maybe to a seamstress or maybe to the falafel vendor and whatnot, there was just such an amazing hospitality, folks dropped everything when you came by just to offer you something to eat and something to drink. And I carry that with me, so I think it's also important to emphasize that I wasn't living in a war zone. I truly was not, it was not the same existence as people who live in Gaza. And that feels very, very lucky, but I also want to speak to how much joy has come to me. And I think about joy also as a teacher, and how much I have exposed my students to literature that is very difficult. I think about Black Lives Matter, and I think about the moments that we've had here post-pandemic, political and racial moments, and how I've had to just kind of think about, the struggle and how that needs to be balanced by moments of joy. And that comes from my education from Black authors and artists who talk about this at length. You can't wake up and pick up the struggle if you don't have joy. How are you going to get out of bed? And I really, really deeply appreciate that. So I've been trying to lead with joy and gratitude every single day. It's been harder, in the last month, but I do find that joy being an educator for sure. I hope that answers your question.
And I think, I mean, I really enjoyed hearing about your time in Palestine as a child, in the West Bank, and just on joy as well. I think, especially when we're thinking and we're seeing like genocide and the erasure of communities, I think it's so important for us to also think about really who is being lost. And there is so much joy and color and life and happiness in Palestinian culture and tradition, and the lives that people have been living in Gaza and also in the West Bank. And I think it's a disservice if we don't remember that,
Sure.
and if we don't think about that, and also if we don't lead with that, like, although these are innocent people that are being killed, they are not nameless and they are not faceless and they are not
Yeah.
people that have had, they are people that have been in Palestine for generations after generations. And I do think, and until we also think about the fact that although, especially in Gaza, they have been living in a war zone, but they have had joy, and there, have been schools and universities and cafes and all kinds of things because people have been living
Right.
there. It's really, we have, I think, such a dissociated relationship in how we look at war zones, because when we see pictures now, we see rubble, but it hasn't always been like that. And I think, like, you're very right in saying that it's important to think about and to hold on to joy.
I think I think with Gaza though, I think it feels like it rubble to me feels like a perpetual kind of thing. And I say that only because of obviously so many bombardments. And ironically enough, I wrote a very short story about a young girl in Gaza and a bombardment. And that was right after 2021, the summer of 2021. But I'll say this too, Samia, my concern is, we talk about joy, but what I think happens with Palestinian people is resilience is weaponized. And so there's this expectation that Palestinians are going to bounce back. And to me, that's different from joy, right? We're talking about the celebration of the human spirit, right? And that on a daily basis, mothers, fathers, teachers, they have to wake every day and try their best to make sure that young people feel secure and seen and thrive. That's separate, right? This idea of resilience, I find problematic, and I was not too far from celebrating that. And I'm speaking in terms of that dehumanizing, so it has this opposite maybe effect. We're celebrating that, Palestinians are still here, but what this latest genocidal episode is showing is that we might not be. Palestinians might actually be wiped out, and we're going to look back and have to basically contend with this. So I am myself very careful, I especially in white spaces. And this is even, when I think about Muslim characters that I've written about, and that can be universal. So they don't necessarily have to be Palestinian characters. And I think that's why the reach for The Beauty of Your Face has been so expansive, because there's so many people who identify with it from a religious standpoint, and not always ethnic and national. And I'm concerned that, you read a story, and it makes you feel like you have somehow engaged in solidarity or action, and then the story's finished, the book is closed, and it's shelved, and nothing really happens after. And it was actually at Dafroom, who I think you also had on your show, who just wrote about this, and I'm so deeply grateful to this article that she wrote about this performative kind of empathy. And it makes me think about how good a book by a marginalized community can make a dominant white community feel, just by giving us space and by, quote, championing our voices, so those are the things that I think about a lot, and I try to talk about, when I get a chance. But, not everybody wants to hear that, because then that dims their feelings of, I suppose, good citizenship, and allowing me space, right? And it's very problematic.
Yeah. I think I've been having a look at what just sort of the things that Itafroom has been going through over the last few weeks, well, almost 2 months now, and I've been really shocked. I've been really very angry on her behalf, because just some of the people have been throwing her books away and doing all kinds of things, and it has raised so many questions about how people find, I don't know, almost how they take advantage of the stories that we're telling without fully engaging with the stories that we're telling. And I believe this so strongly. If you pick up A Woman Is No Man or Evil Eye, or you pick up The Beauty of Your Face, if you do not have a deep appreciation for Palestinian history and heritage, if you do not understand what the book is trying to tell you, which is about intergenerational trauma and how what living as a persecuted community does to you, if you do not take that away from the book truly, and you do not then understand that this is what should inform your politics and your action,
and to engage that,
exactly, what have you actually, like, did you even read the book? Like, it does. I really feel very frustrated with this performative sense of allyship that, you know, it feels like there are people that are almost like tick boxing, checking a list off. And we have seen this with the Black Lives Matter movement. People have been reading books by Black authors, but when it comes down to understanding institutional racism and colonization and decolonization, all of that, the things that they've supposedly read, have gone out of the window.
And there's no action.
Yeah.
It must have been maybe it was the second week of the bombardment on Gaza that a book club that had reached out to me way back in August. And it's actually a book club that is from my school neighborhood. They exist in the school neighborhood. They're a park district. They basically canceled me. Under the guise of, there were logistical issues, and it was very, very hurtful, especially because, again, the proximity to the school, these, I know that families would have relationships with both places, where I teach, and then this particular park district. And I've been clinging to tiny hope that maybe it was logistical, but when I responded about my disappointment and, I was frank about my concern about the coincidence in time, especially since it had been confirmed, there was no response. So that was confirmation. And, Samia, it was all the things that I had heard anecdotally to now be experiencing them. So even as I, have a manuscript on submission and seeing the concern in my agents' faces, and them worrying, do we send it out? Do we hold on to it? What do we do? I don't know. It feels like these extreme experiences of, we want to gobble up this marginalized community so that, we could say that we made space, that we are getting better as a publishing, industry. We are diverse. We are raising voices. And then the flip side is, well, we don't want to touch that because, and I'm so disheartened. But I also think about other artists, actors, musicians, even, people in other sectors of our society who have really, they're paying incredibly high prices for voicing solidarity with Palestine. And, for me, again, I feel that privilege of, well, I can continue to teach. And if this writing career, just kind of stops, until whenever, or maybe it never again, is going to thrive. That still feels like a small loss. And I know that sounds easy for me to say, but I mean that. I mean that, in the depths of my soul, because again, I think about having my life, and how grateful I am to be able to wake in a place that, has electricity and water. And I get to see my daughters thrive, and my nieces and nephews and my students, all of that feels so much more important, but I don't want to be misleading. It feels like a loss otherwise, because it's our stories then are silenced, right, and are erased. And I've always felt that responsibility, So you can see, Samia, I'm just like, just fractured, on so many different levels. And I just sometimes find it hard to articulate everything that, is in my heart, in my mind, as I'm watching in real time, the genocide of my people.
Yeah. With the publishing industry, Sahar, I'm so sorry that that so many of these conversations are even happening. And I think we mentioned this before we even started recording, just the anti-Palestinian rhetoric, the pro-Israeli rhetoric is so blatant and so overt now in a way that it hasn't been so much previously. Obviously there has been some, but a lot of it has kind of been backdoor and hidden. And I think the publishing industry really has so much work to do. And I feel especially off the back of the Black Lives Matter movement, there has been a shift. We have seen more Black authors being published, more Muslim authors being published. But the biggest frustration I have is that the representation is still so massively flawed. Yes. So many of the stories that are getting supported and getting published are still based on trauma. Right. There is no joy in the stories. Right. And I think the representation of Muslim women, especially, and Muslim men, still has so far to go, because we're still seeing those same harmful rhetorics about conservative families and women that need to go and take their hijab off
and white saviors, right? And yes, and things that are palatable in terms of happy endings because a character has rejected maybe Islam, right? Yeah. Or has assimilated in a way that is, equates to the American dream, which is so incredibly flawed and ridiculous, right? I mean, assimilation is such a horribly failed experiment, but that's America. You get here and you are expected to just completely shed your native identity, right? There is just no space to hold being American and then being these other identities. So you're expected to just, silence those stories and, to get with the program. And I'm so happy that you talked about trauma because somebody called it trauma porn way back. And that's actually when there was a book that was incredibly problematic. I think was that 2018 or 2019 American Dirt. Do you remember this novel? Yes. Not that we have to get into that. But there were many Mexican American voices, who spoke out and discussed, just how much, white readers enjoy, being voyeurs to such horrible, horrible trauma and violence against Mexican immigrants, Mexican Americans. And I think about that a lot too. And how much am I inflating that, in my stories, because there's this very challenging balance, I feel, as a Palestinian-American writer, to reveal, to expose, but also making sure that these characters are human beings, not, and I also, it's humanizing to me is also such, to me, it's as problematic as the word Islamophobia, so to have to humanize human beings, is just, again, mind-boggling. I'm experiencing all this cognitive dissonance, again, which is making me maybe not always articulate. And I'm having to balance what are very familiar human experiences with a backdrop of history and politics, right? But I'm here for it. I'm here for it. I think the other thing that I also have, I pay attention to a lot is what I think it was Rita Dove, the Black American poet, who said, the hyphenated writer, their burden is double-fold because it's writing about and representing. So it's the representation piece, but then also writing well, right? So telling a good story. So, I want to write beautifully. And I feel like that's not the concern when I'm in certain spaces on certain panels. They want to know, did this happen to you, Sahar? Is this your, autofiction? And I'm like, not one bit, right? Are you going to ask me about how I crafted the story? Are you going to ask me about moving from short stories to novel writing? It's quite, also, I would say maybe even a double standard, when you have a white writer, maybe on the same panel, and what they're asked. Or even I think about how my editor asked me to cut down on graphic scenes in the beauty of your face, and said, basically, you can have, it might have been 2. And I'm not even very graphic, Simon. You might have seen that, but I don't hold back. So it's also who I am as a writer. And I like to hit those particular details, I hope, in a very compelling way, but it's not, for shock value. And I thought, would you be asking a male writer to do this? Or even maybe a Muslim Palestinian male writer? Would you be asking them to kind of pull back? It's been quite a journey, one that has been very educational, one that I continue to evolve from, writing the beauty of your face, for sure.
So I'm really interested in understanding a little bit more about your writing journey. So obviously The Beauty of Your Face is a novel, and you have written several short stories, and I'm assuming write short stories all the time. Maybe not.
No, I do. Yes. Yeah.
What has because you are also a teacher by profession, what has your writing journey been like?
So yeah, short stories are my heart and soul still. In fact, I'm working on a short story collection that was inspired by tatriz, the Palestinian embroidery. So, yeah. Oh, okay. So when the pandemic happened, Wafa Ignaim, who is tatriz and tea, if you know her, she's this amazing Palestinian-American who there are so many people before her to whom she credits for the reemergence of tatriz and preservation of tatriz, but she's become a scholar, and she hosted some free Zoom workshops. And I had actually done tatriz when I was in Palestine. So I had done that as part of like an art class at my school in the West Bank. And I thought, you know what, this is exactly what I mean, because my brain, my brain is scrambled. It's even hard for me to read print. So I started going to audiobooks. So I thought, and this will keep my hands busy, so something really just changed in my brain. And so I signed up for a cohort after that. And I thought, okay, it was just going to be a knitting embroidery collective, but it ended up actually being a lecture series. But so many of us in the cohort, we were doing our tatriz and listening, but I swear I was just like taking notes. So I didn't even pick up my fabric and patterns. I was so blown away by the rich history of tatriz that as I'm listening to her, I'm already seeing characters and stories and place. And so I started writing a collection that they were inspired by different motifs and patterns, and they basically span pre-mandate Palestine all the way to contemporary. And I say this very happily. A handful of them have been published, have actually won awards, so I'm very excited. I'm hoping that soon they will be in a single collection. But before that, and before The Beauty of Your Face, I did publish a short story collection through a publishing contest. It was actually the work of my MFA program. So I have been steeped, in short story, in the genre of short story. But moving to a novel was quite a task and labor. I love the short story because it is contained. There is an end in sight, all these like really, practical things. But I also love how there is this distillation, of getting the experience down, as succinctly, and as eloquently and cogently as possible. So distilling a story, I think, is what, I mean to say there. With The Beauty of Your Face, because I saw Afaf in terms of periods of her life, I still was able to hold on to the short story, right, construct. And that made it easy. It was handling the shooter framing, which was the present, that was a little bit more challenging. But, I hope that it became its most, elevated, polished form. But moving away from The Beauty of Your Face has been, since, I would say, even more challenging, because of the stories that I want to tell and having to basically start from scratch. So when people ask me about process, I say it's always different. If you're asking me about habits, that's a different question, right? But the process of writing another novel, it all kinds of new challenges, all over again, but I've learned a lot. I've so thoroughly enjoyed it, so I will continue, to take up that labor.
Absolutely, please do. I mean, I loved The Beauty of Your Face, and I honestly, I can't wait to read more of your work.
I'm so happy. Thank you.
And I do want to get into the intricacies of the novel a little bit as well. But obviously, you are a writer and you are a storyteller. So what are some of the things that really drive you as a storyteller? What things are really important for you when you're writing?
Maybe I can answer this question from where I start. So where maybe a story begins. And it is truly from this desire to tell an interesting and captivating story. So all the things that we just talked about in terms of my responsibilities of representation are not always immediate, which I think is a really, really good thing, because I don't want that to interfere with the storytelling aspects in terms of character development, plot, like all these things that every other writer gets to do without thinking twice, who are not maybe from a marginalized community, who are basically able to write their truth and not, have to censor or think twice, or have to negotiate that. I want to tell a good story. And so those seeds are very, they're bursting, in terms of wanting to grow and for me to harvest them. I'm all about a good story. That's really, why I love to write. So I'm about all the things that, I mentioned earlier, the human experience, right? And things that in the end are familiar and then become universal, which is great, right? But they're still all within the context, a particular community, right? Being Palestinian, being the daughter of immigrants, being Muslim, and so on. But I start with those, seeds that come from, maybe it's a news story. Maybe it's something that my mother once shared, while we were preparing Warak Dawali. I got a lot of great stories from my mom and the rolled grape leaves. It feels like such a trope, but it's so true. And I think, that joyful instinct to tell a good story is where I always begin. What it ends up being is actually a lot more work, because I'm trying to write all the way through and not have to censor and critique before I get everything on the page. And even then, I try to not worry too much about, is this too political? Is this going to, sit well, with a mainstream audience and whatnot? And that's hard. Samia. I'm still, I still do that, so I wish I could say that, I just write and send it off, but I do have, many moments of, what do I need? Will something not be accepted or acceptable, by a particular editor, and maybe even by my agents who've been so wonderful. But are they going to bristle maybe, at something? And luckily that has not been the case, and I did have an editor say to me, it can't just be about Palestine, which my gut was like, what do you mean? But it's all about Palestine. But what they meant, and this has been so important moving forward from that conversation, is that I'm a storyteller. So I can't go into this with, here's my political stance, here's what everyone needs to know about Palestine. It's just not going to work. That's the work, I think, of a journalist. I think that can show up in some other capacity. I have to be careful, because I grew up with zero representative books, but I loved them because they were great stories. So even if I didn't see myself in these stories, and they were mostly, white characters, I just love them so much because they spoke to me in these different human ways, right? And that's what I always try to come back to, and I hope that is clear, and I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. I'm just interested. Were you ever at a point where you weren't writing for publication?
That's a really good question. No, and here's why. I was writing my whole life, but mostly writing personal essays, and always because I was required to. So maybe it was in high school, and then maybe even in college. But I started writing short stories with the very intentional mission to publish after discovering Naomi Shihab Nye. So when I found her poetry, and then especially her book of essays, Never in a Hurry, just about what it meant to be a Palestinian-American and a writer, I just, I had this moment of a clear understanding that my story mattered, who I was mattered, and there was a space for me, but that was also thinking very naively, because I had no idea that the publishing industry was still very, very, very limited, and who they were going to allow in. So a lot of gatekeeping. But after Naomi Shihab Nye, I just remember reading other, if they were not Palestinian, they might have also been in translation. I'm thinking of the Lebanese author, Hanan El-Sheikh, who I absolutely adore her work. And she was publishing in Arabic, but then I think she also wrote in English. I think that book, In London, one of my favorites. She also just, validated my voice, and again, that possibly there was space for me. And then writers like Leila Lelami, the Moroccan American writer, and I just kept thinking, okay, for sure. And so and it's funny because I'm having to sort of battle my own students, who some of them just want to write, but they know coming into my class that we're going to be sharing these stories, right? And I'm going to be huge about publishing them. And to me, I want them to understand that their story matters. It might not matter to everybody, but there's an audience for them, be it a single person to whom, or for whom the story is going to really make a difference, or, a bunch of people. I think I've come to a point where I'm like, my story deserves to be told. So even saying that I need people to champion them, I'm dropping that mentality. I deserve as much as the next person to publish. So yes, I think I have always had my eye on publishing, because of this feeling that they were great stories, and they deserve to be in the world, and it's, again, not for maybe every single audience, but they at least deserved a shot.
Yeah, no, that's really great. I mean, my reason for asking the question was because I've spoken to a lot of authors who talk about the difference between writing or like publishing a debut novel and then how you feel as a writer when you come to writing your second novel. And especially if it's the case where your debut novel started off as a writing project that you never believed was going to get published. And I really love that idea that before you're constrained or impacted by the publishing industry and marketing and sales and all of those, very arbitrary things in many ways, before you're impacted by any of that, to be your true authentic self as a writer, to be able to unleash yourself onto the page and to tell whatever story you want to tell. I think there's something so beautiful and profound in that. But having said that, I feel like you are very true to yourself as a writer. And just by you saying that the stories deserve to be told, regardless of how they may or may not be received by people like readers, but also by the publishing industry, that firm belief that your story deserves to be told is powerful enough in itself. So thank you so much for that. But I want to talk about the beauty of your face, which I absolutely love the story. So we meet Afaf, who is a young Palestinian-American woman. And we follow her journey basically as she kind of grows up. And there's two timelines. The modern day timeline is that Afaf is teaching in a school where a white American shooter has come into the building, and we kind of follow what happens there as well. And it's very... it's so poetically done in many ways, because sort of as the shooter makes his way through the building and as Afaf is impacted by that, more and more of the previous story is sort of unlocked and told. And I really like that sort of that juxtaposition of it. But where did the character of Afaf particularly come from? Like what was it like for you putting this character together, because she is incredible?
Oh, I appreciate that. And I want to say, I've just received so many beautiful messages, and in book clubs, how close people got to Afaf, and just to hear her spoken about in this 3-dimensional way, is just that is like the highest praise. People got so close to her and to some of the other characters in a way I think that I was not prepared for. So thank you. And to call it poetic is just so lovely. Thank you for that too. So there was another iteration of this novel that included multiple Muslim American characters. And I can't precisely pinpoint why that telling was not successful, except that I realized I had to go back to the very beginning of this person who was going to be impacted by the shooting at some point, right? So I realized, my goodness, and this is, what I believe in. This is why I enjoy being a teacher, is that we have to share our stories. We carry so many different stories, and we don't always have a space to tell them, really. And it's not until someone says, "Tell me where you come from," that, my goodness, right? The floodgates open, and it's such a beautiful thing. And again, not some of us will never have a really meaningful chance to do that. I realized then that if I didn't go back to the beginning that brought these characters to this very critical moment in time, I didn't think it would be a complete story, really. And I felt the same about the shooter, that if we did not see, some of the things that made him who he was, and it was not at all to justify his actions, because I know some people were not happy. In fact, I received these from readers who loved the book but said, "I wish the shooter was out." And I said, well, that was very deliberate. In fact, some agents wouldn't take my project because they wanted me to delete him. And I thought that, again, was a way of erasing this horrible bigotry that exists in America, and the danger that visibly hijabi women experience going out of their homes, right? So there was no way I was going to drop that, because every time we returned to him, it was an intentional jarring. It reminded us, here's the threat. So we're not going to diminish that. But with Afaf in particular, I wanted to create a character that readers would have seen from a very first important moment when she loses her sister, and they're on that journey. I could say that, was I trying to cultivate, compassion, empathy? I maybe, but I wasn't worried so much about, this very superficial loving her and even liking her, as much as I want you folks to see, so these are all the things that end up creating, who she is when she comes face to face with that shooter. And it was so beautiful to me, because as I mentioned earlier, they were these individual stories, right? That create this whole human being. And not just her, but also Baba, right? But also her brother, Majid. And also, we get the story of her mother. And all of that felt very true and very necessary. So it would not become this sensationalized active shooter in the building, ripped from the headlines, which unfortunately, you probably know, Samia, this was inspired because of the 3 real-life hate murders of Yusor Abu Salha, her husband and her sister, which rattled me, And I also thought, how am I going to tell that story sensitively and again, not appropriating their deaths? So that's how Afaf came to be. Yeah.
I am so glad that Atlas came to be. And one of the things that I really enjoyed reading about was Afaf's relationship with her Baba. And I think it felt so refreshing, because, for a number of reasons, because I don't think we don't see enough in literature about daughters and fathers and daughters. We don't see nearly enough anyway. But also, the representation of Muslim men, Arab men, is still so heavily negative. But in Baba, what we see is this very emotional, or emotionally tuned, a great father, very sensitive, very much at the heart of his community. And it felt like so many men that I know and I love, and it really it really spoke to me, and I was so grateful for that representation. And he wasn't perfect. In fact, none of your characters are perfect, which also I love, because nobody is perfect. This is the right, or the true reflection, I guess, of humanity. But what really drove you in terms of the relationship between Afaf and Baba, and the character of Baba that you depicted?
Yeah. Well, you said it. You have so many of these kind of men in your life, and so do I. And I'm just like, why are we not seeing characters like this? But I'll be honest. Again, I'm not always thinking on that level of representation, but that something was pulling me, to create parents that were incredibly dysfunctional. You said, they were not perfect and flawed. But I very quickly saw a father figure who was so loving. And I was also interested in depicting a mother character who I thought, and I know this because of the response from readers, was very upsetting and jarring and not what they were expecting, because we have these tropes of the domineering, right, the oppressive father, and then almost like the pious, the suffering, silently suffering mother, which Muntaha, Afaf's mother, she suffers, but there's mental health. There is a fracture in the family that she cannot mend because of losing this daughter, from also, missing her home country. I was just so excited to write about those characters that might be a surprise and unpredictable. And even with Majid, he and Afaf are so close and so loving, but they have different politics, right? He ends up being, sort of a-religious, right? And even thinks that she's being brainwashed, when she wears the hijab. All of that feels very real to me, very nuanced. It's what makes up different family units. But with Baba, yeah, I was so, when people ask me, who do I enjoy writing? I always think of Baba. Mama was very difficult. She was incredibly challenging. And so was Afaf when she was a teenager. But Baba, he just felt so natural too. Someone who I also experienced, not to get into that, autobiographical, pressure. But yes, I have been surrounded by men like this, and then I've been surrounded by those characters that you mentioned who are very harmful, right? But who gets the page time most of the time, right? That is definitely a concern, and it felt really good to have Baba, who we sensed his love, but was also struggling, but also helps Afaf begin this journey to Islam. And then, of course, is a circle of women who really absorb her, right? And to me, I really enjoyed writing those women from the Noor Society, from the mosque. And I think about my father-in-law, and he has since passed, who's also a poet, a writer, a professor. He was part of an effort to build mosques in our community here. And so I, if people ask me, is it autobiographical? I'm like, well, it's about my community. How about that? And so I love when people who are close to me say, that's very familiar. And, sometimes it's so familiar that they're like, is it based on? And that's the beauty of course, of fiction, is that I could take some of these lived experiences, the stories that I've been told, and I can reinvent them. I can expand them, but in no way, Samia, was I going to inflate the stereotypes, Absolutely not. In fact, I was concerned that with Neda, I'm like, okay, there's that story of I don't want to be, who I am. I want to be American. I want to be white. But that also existed. And I can tell you plenty of stories of growing up in the late 70s and early 80s, girls running away from home, including my sister's best friend. And that is so ingrained in my memory, but that can't be the only story. And that's what I'm always going to talk about. And that's what I'm always going to write towards, because, in some of my stories, there are definitely male villains, but also female villains. But I'll be honest with you, Samia, I'm really interested in the fraught mother-daughter relationship, and having people understand there aren't these extremes of piety and then debauchery. You know what I mean? I'm just, that hasn't been my experience. And that's not how I think many of us, have experienced family members and friends, and community members.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, no, I really enjoyed hearing you speak about that process and just the different things that you've been interested in. And the importance of also just reminding people that the Arab American or Muslim American or Muslim British experience is not singular.
Right.
there are literally millions of people that each live their own life with their own ideas and their own histories, and their it's really, I think the problem is that what happens is that one singular story will then get sort of used as an idea as to how things are, which is harmful and is majorly problematic, and which is why a diversity of characters and stories is so incredibly important. And actually, I asked Itaf a similar question, because not like Baba, but a lot of the male protagonists in her book are harmful characters. And again, she said, like, I know I'm kind of drawn to this, and I'm drawn to this as a story and as an issue, but I still try and show through other characters that this is not the only way. She's like, you will always find in my characters, you may have like the main male character may be an absolute narcissist, but you will still find his friends or people in the community that are actually the complete opposite, but you have to look, and you have to read it. And I thought that was really also really important and just also very true. But yeah, anyway.
Yeah, and I think it sells, right? Samuel, like, so when I'm thinking about the white dominant readership and publishing industry, they're going to want a story that makes them feel good, right? Yeah. And what makes them feel good? The fraudulent American dream, the white savior narrative, right? Yeah. All these things that they want to perpetuate, assimilation, all those things, are going to cultivate the good feeling that a book, a story, is supposed to, right? Yes. Render. But I think, what we're also making a dent. And I appreciate every Palestinian-American writer who gets, again, the chance that they deserve to tell their stories. And I think everyone is entitled, right, to write their truth. Yeah. It can be so, I think, challenging, that burden of representation, but it's also one for me personally that I will carry, that I will hold, while also, I hope, telling a pretty good story,
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, another reason or another element of your book that I found so refreshing was Afaf's finding of faith-based community, the sisters at the mosque, and the community, and the faith, and reconnecting with her faith and finding that spirituality and that connection to God. Now, I felt so emotional reading the book because a lot of that is sort of some of the experiences that I've had and I continue to have, but also because I had never seen it in a book. And I feel, I have seen a lot of stories where women especially end up leaving their faith-based communities or their faith, and not nearly enough of that nuanced exploration of actually why faith is so important to people and why the role that it can play in community and how community can really lift you up and almost save you, because we see that with Afaf. We see that she is almost saved by this community that she finds. And I think what I liked about it as well was that, like, Baba never forced it on her. He kind of, he was a huge part of his community, and he let that example almost lead itself. And you can tell in the book that he is also so overcome with emotion when he realizes that Afaf is actually coming with him and she's joining the same community, and it brings them closer together. But also he still never imposed that judgment on her or forced her to do things. And we follow her as she kind of navigates being this Palestinian-American young person in America, trying to understand her dual identity and trying to fit in, and understanding, like, how far can she push her boundaries and what she's comfortable with doing and what not. And I think that will relate, and that relates or will be relatable for so many young people who are constantly asking themselves these questions based on what they know their faith teaches or their community says. Can I go here, or should I go here? And what kind of friends should I have? It's a really fraught time for so many people. And so, I mean, I think to begin with, I want to thank you for that story, because it gave me a sense of almost like belonging and reflection that I had not really seen in literature before. But I want to know what was important to you, why did you decide to have that element in the story? Because it could have been anything, right? Like, we think about like a turning point in a character's life. It could have been, she could have had like a near-death experience, for example, or she could have met a singular person. Why did you decide on having this Muslim community come in the way that it did?
I think it's because of where I started with that hate killing. And so, just like what we've been talking about, um, how do we engage in these terrible issues? How can we get closer to maybe some of these challenging questions about, the awful things that bigotry, hatred, visits upon marginalized communities? I felt in that time that I wanted to tell a story about being a child of immigrants, but also about being Muslim, that kind of expanded the narrative. But you're telling me, Samia, that you really have not seen. So maybe this is also one of these where, and I know I have not really, but I thought let's. Why can't it be celebrated and not something that we're trying to escape? Because that's just not been my experience. So, for example, the women, that's actually based on a true experience where when a woman would start wearing hijab, there'd be a party. And I'd been to them and they were so beautiful. And that was happening in the 1990s. It felt almost like burgeoning of being visibly hijabi or visibly Muslim with the hijab. It felt like such a celebration, and it was just such a beautiful thing to witness. So I felt like maybe when we talk about representation and talk about literature being, no matter what, a political act, because even not writing about certain things is also political, right? By omitting, I decided this needed space. So after this atrocious act of violence, after the normalization of the idea of Islamophobia, I thought, for me, it felt like enough. I said, I think I want to explore, what does it mean to live as a Muslim American? What does it mean to feel like you don't belong sometimes in your immediate communities? And what does fear and bigotry and hatred look like? I don't know that I've answered, every single question that I started with, but literature is beautiful because it can leave those things still open-ended, right? And I hope those conversations went on after people closed the book. But yeah, I would say that it's definitely started from, what do I want to contribute in terms of combating that destructive view of Muslims, particularly in my community. I hope that I could speak to that particular community and with some nuance, with complexity, and again, being very aware of the stereotypes.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I think the nuance you present in the book is so like powerful and just so true to life. And also reminded that you're telling one story, and you are very careful, I think, in your work not to imply that everybody is like this. You also present a number of characters and a number of different people in your writing, which I think is so important. But yeah, I absolutely loved it. And obviously, a lot of the book is about Afaf's sort of reckoning almost, or balancing of her mixed identity. And that, again, I think is something that so many of us continue to deal with. And I feel like conversations are shifting slightly, and we're having a little bit more of like a nuanced perspective of, I'm not American, or I'm not British, and I'm not Palestinian or Pakistani or whatever it may be. I think there is a lot more nuance come in now. But one of the things that, and I think you do bring it up in the book, but I've heard you talk about it before as well, is this idea of privilege, but also of survivor's guilt. Especially when your roots are in a community that is persecuted like the Palestinians, or people that live in poverty or live in a different form of war or persecution. And I just wanted to ask you to reflect on that a little bit, because sometimes I find personally that dealing with the privilege and dealing with that survivor's guilt is actually a bigger, almost like burden or a bigger weight to carry than this sort of like, well, where exactly do I fit in? And I just wondered what your thoughts were.
Yeah. And, I felt it more than ever with, or since October 7th, with what the atrocities on Gaza right now. And it makes me think a lot about action and trying not to be performative in, the ways that I'm resisting or trying to amplify our Palestinian voices. I think a lot, Samia, about, my goodness, who would I be if my parents hadn't come to the United States? So where would I be? Would I be alive? And that, I think, is definitely a shared feeling when I talk to other Palestinians in my family and in the community. And I don't know that I'll ever stop feeling that way. I think, will it dim, once this particular episode, whatever it ends up looking like, is stopped. And I don't know what the words are, because of course the impact is going to go on, right? When we think about the 1 point, is it 2 or 7 million who are now displaced, who are still living, but are now displaced. So I'm exploring the privilege, I would say, more since The Beauty of Your Face, in my short stories and in some novel projects, one in particular. And it feels like it's very, in that regard, very timely. But of course, I'd been writing it before October 7th. But I think that's the other problem, is that sometimes it's also exhausting to be timely and to always be relevant, right? So when we think about, what we're also expected to write about and what we want to write about, like I know someone who I met recently who was worried about writing a story in which the Arab identities were not necessarily visible or distinguished, and we talked about, and it was great having that conversation, because it made me think about that creative impulse, and then what that starts to look like when you start thinking about the backdrop of politics, religion, gender, and all these other things. But this survivor's guilt it's a newer feeling for me, and I don't know what to do about it, except maybe I'll be writing about it soon. So other than trying to protest in all the ways that feel valid and solid and, quite frankly, safe, I'm going to be honest about that. And that's where, the privilege comes in. That's all I can do, I think about how, when the Intifada happened in 1987, how quickly our schools were shut down, and how my parents were not going to sit by while their daughter's education was interrupted. So, we got our tickets and we came right back, and how I had taken that for granted until maybe I started writing seriously for publication. I don't know. And you know what? I have to be honest. I mean, I don't know if I answered your question. I can't remember what the first point of it was. And if I gave you not a solid, but maybe,
no, no, it's absolutely fine. Because obviously the question was about survivor's guilt and privilege. And I just wanted you to reflect on that, especially in in regards to like how that is sometimes or often it's heavier and it's more weightier than the other questions we have about our identity.
Oh, yes. I'm sorry. About belonging, which is what I
Yeah.
have mostly. Yes. I would say that, no. It's certainly heavier for sure. Yeah. I would say, but it's so new to me that I'm still kind of, waiting in it. And like I said, will I end up writing about it in some way? But I also don't like to be so heavy handed. We've been talking about this since the beginning. I want my characters to sort of face these things and negotiate these things in ways that feel very authentic, right, and real. So I really don't know about I don't know what more to say about that. That it's just such a gutting and dark place that I've been where that is,
absolutely.
survivor's guilt. Yeah. And it's interesting because maybe there are other immigrants, children of immigrants or immigrants and refugees. I'd love to hear more about that, maybe, from other communities, because as I mentioned, this has been the most visceral that survivor's guilt has felt for me. If that answers that. Yeah. As opposed to like, and I love your question that, I'm glad that you went back to it, because it's mostly like, I want to belong. I want to fit in. Right. Yeah. And so by doing that though, you are shedding something. Right. Yeah. But with Afaf, luckily for her, and this is also the reality, I would say for my daughters who are adults, this is now their generational experience. They have those communities of belonging. In fact, they can say it's okay not to be in this other space, right? But they also have to be actively protecting their rights in those spaces, maybe, that attempt to reject them. But you're right. It is a different kind of experience than feeling this really awful and, guilt-ridden experience of that.
Yeah. So like my parents were born and raised in Pakistan. And so my family were living in like modern day Pakistan pre-partition. So we were not massively impacted by the partition in 1948. But so my parents moved to the UK in the 70s. And so my siblings like were all born here and like, we were very much British. But I feel an immense sense of privilege, and I don't know if I have survivor's guilt in the same way, because I don't know of a lot of people that have like died in Pakistan, and it's not as if like if I was there I also would have died in the same way, although there have been natural disasters, huge earthquakes and huge flooding, but it's not quite the same thing, I don't think. But it is something I reckon with almost on a daily basis, because I know so many of my people in Pakistan are living in abject poverty, without food, without water, without electricity. There are so many girls and also boys that are denied access to education and schooling. And I feel that so heavily, like so heavily, especially because I work in the charity sector as well, so I have this sort of like direct connection. I get a lot of information and images and case studies from the field, but also I visit Pakistan. I used to visit my own family. I still have uncles and aunts. My grandmother lived there for a long time before she passed away. But more recently, I visit my husband's family, who a lot of them are there. In fact, I think all of his family essentially is still in Pakistan and in Kashmir. And so I see that sort of the poverty and the struggle and the strife very closely, very intimately on a regular basis. Yeah. And sometimes I don't know what to do with it, because I feel so gross at the fact that, I know I can open a tap and I have water. And not only that, I have warm water. And I know that like so many people, maybe my husband's close family is, I don't consider them, they don't live in those same conditions, but I know so many people that do. And sometimes I don't know what to do with it. And it was only until a few months ago I was speaking to Leila Wazir on the podcast, who is like a mixed race writer. She lives in London. Her father is Mauritian, and so we were talking about this sense of privilege as well. And the one thing that she said that has stayed with me since then is just that to constantly remember that we live in a world that is deeply interconnected. And every single thought you have, every single thing that you do, the thing that you buy, the thing that you support, the websites that you open, everything has a knock-on effect on somebody else. And you are in control of who you are impacting and how you are impacting them. And that doesn't mean that like in every moment you're going to make a choice that is selfless. Like sometimes you're going to want to just go and eat a burger or like go and watch a theater, and maybe there's nobody deserving, quote unquote, that is going to benefit from that. But just to remember that actually you are in control of doing that. And I think that is the one thing that has been helping me since October 7th.
Yes.
In remembering that I can make choices and decisions, and why they may feel small and insignificant, it is the one thing that I can do. Because I can't impact or influence foreign policy. I cannot stop the state of Israel from doing what it's doing. I cannot convince my prime minister to change his mind by myself. I'm hoping that mass protests will make a difference, but maybe that won't even do it. But what I can do is I can use my money in the right way. I can boycott, I can protest, I can write, I can write letters, I can support my Palestinian friends and brothers and sisters and people.
And
I find great strength in that.
Yeah. And I appreciate that. You know, we were talking about how you cannot despair. You know, you can't let those feelings of hopelessness become a permanent state. You know, I also think that, you know, we talk about privilege flippantly sometimes, you know, and that can make us very complacent. So like you, and I think as many, many others, you know, October 7th has really just had us look inward, and, you know, that inward reflection, you know, to me now there's got to be an active output. And, you know, I mentioned that even if I don't march in the demonstrations, and they, you know, we talked about just how enormous they've been. I'm close to Chicago, and they've been happening every single weekend, and we're talking in the thousands. And I know what my resources are. I know, you know, what I can do. And, you know, you said it might not change, you know, things in a massive way, but I think that these are all important revolutionary acts that become part of a larger collective momentum. So I also don't want to downplay, right, our daily contributions and whatnot. But I think I have been definitely thinking about, you know, I can throw this word around that I've been privileged, but what does that mean? You know, how am I engaging it? Where is it showing up? You know, how is it affecting my action? And I hope it's been productive, and I hope it's been positive. You know?
Yeah, absolutely. And on that note, Sahar, you know, it has been so wonderful speaking to you. I have really, really enjoyed it. You have given me so much to think about, and I really hope that you have found some comfort in this space that
I really have.
That we have here today. So thank you so much for your time today.
I really appreciate it. And, you know, thank you to your readers and listeners. You know, inshallah khair, as we say, for Palestine. Inshallah, Palestine will be free.
Inshallah. Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much to Sahar for her time today. This was such a moving, insightful, and hugely informative conversation. I really enjoyed it and I hope that you did too. If you enjoy the podcast, please follow The Diverse Bookshelf on your podcast platform of choice and connect with me on social media. I would really appreciate it if you could rate and leave a review, as it helps more people find the show.